It's done. No one suspects anything. The driver's voice echoed down the hospital corridor, but he had no idea the new nurse was listening. For 3 weeks, Marine General Bruce Hopkins had been lying motionless in that bed. The crash that nearly killed him was ruled mechanical failure. His most trusted driver, Julius, played the devastated friend perfectly, but Maria Blum noticed things others didn't. The way Julius's jaw tightened when doctors mentioned recovery, the way his eyes darted to the door, the way the general's hands clenched when Julius entered the room. Then came the phone call, the confession, and Maria's impossible choice. Expose a would-be killer, or stay silent and let him finish what he started. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you are watching from in the comments. Enjoy the story. It's done. No one suspects anything. The words hung in the sterile air of Richmond Memorial Hospital. Maria Blum stood frozen in the corridor, partially hidden by the medication cart she'd been organizing. The voice belonged to Julius Cage, the driver who'd been visiting General Bruce Hopkins every single day since the accident 3 weeks ago. Maria's heart pounded as she watched him through the small window in the door. Julius stood with his back to her, phone pressed against his ear, his free hand gripping the door frame so tightly his knuckles had gone white. She moved closer, careful to stay out of sight. The phone call continued, but Julius had lowered his voice. Maria caught only fragments. Words that made her blood run cold. Words like "won't wake up" and "evidence" and "finished." When Julius finally ended the call and walked past her without a second glance, Maria felt her hands trembling. She looked down the hallway toward room 847, where Marine General Bruce Hopkins had been lying motionless for 3 weeks. His eyes closed, his body still, the machines breathing for him, monitoring every heartbeat. Maria had been assigned to his care only 5 days ago, but in those 5 days, she'd noticed things. Small things. The kind of details most people miss. The way Julius positioned himself between the general and the door during every visit. The way his jaw tightened whenever a doctor mentioned the possibility of recovery. The way the general's hands would clench, just slightly, almost imperceptibly, whenever Julius entered the room. And now this phone call. Maria walked slowly toward room 847. Through the window, she could see General Hopkins exactly as she'd left him 20 minutes ago. Eyes closed, face peaceful, completely still. But as she stood there watching, she noticed something she'd seen before but never quite understood. His right hand, resting on the white hospital blanket, was clenched in a tight fist. She pushed open the door and stepped inside. The room smelled of antiseptic and something else she couldn't quite name. Fear, maybe, or secrets. Standing at the foot of the bed, Maria studied the general's face. Bruce Hopkins had built his entire life on one unbreakable rule: no one was above the law. She'd read about him in the newspapers over the years. The Marine general who'd sent corrupt officials, organized crime bosses, and entire criminal networks to prison. A man who'd made enemies in every shadow, in every dark corner of the justice system. And now one of those enemies had finally gotten to him. The question was, which one? Maria glanced at the general one more time, then back toward the door. Before she could make sense of what she'd just overheard, before she could decide what to do with the suspicion growing in her chest, she needed to understand something crucial. She needed to understand exactly who Bruce Hopkins was, and why someone would want him dead. But to understand how he got here, to understand why a decorated Marine general was lying in a hospital bed while his most trusted driver made sinister phone calls in empty corridors, you need to know who Bruce Hopkins really was. You need to know the man behind the uniform, the cases he'd built, the enemies he'd made, and the one person he should never have trusted. Before I tell you how Maria Blum uncovered the truth, before I show you the evidence that would bring a would-be killer to justice, hit that subscribe button if you believe justice should always win. The trolls who side with criminals won't, but you will. Because this story is about what happens when the law can't speak for itself, when the only witness is trapped inside his own body, and when the only hope comes from a nurse who refused to look away. 3 weeks earlier, nobody would have guessed this was coming. Bruce Hopkins stood in the federal courthouse in Alexandria, Virginia, watching as another corrupt official was led away in handcuffs. It was a Tuesday afternoon, unseasonably warm for October, and the man had just been sentenced to 15 years for bribery and obstruction of justice. Bruce didn't smile. He never smiled at moments like these. Justice wasn't about satisfaction. It was about principle. For 30 years, Marine General Bruce Hopkins had lived by one unbreakable rule: no one was above the law. Not politicians, not corporate executives, not fellow officers, not even friends. The law was the law, and Bruce Hopkins enforced it without hesitation, without compromise, without mercy for those who believed their power made them untouchable. His career had been legendary. Starting as a young Marine Corps lawyer, Bruce had worked his way through the ranks with a reputation that preceded him into every courtroom, every hearing, every investigation. He'd prosecuted war criminals who thought rank would protect them. He'd dismantled organized crime networks that had operated for decades. He'd sent a sitting congressman to prison for corruption. He'd exposed a defense contractor whose faulty equipment had cost American lives. He'd taken down a pharmaceutical executive who'd knowingly distributed contaminated medication to military hospitals. The cases were different, but the thread connecting them was always the same. Bruce Hopkins never looked the other way. When evidence appeared, he followed it. When witnesses came forward, he protected them. When powerful people tried to intimidate him, he worked harder. His colleagues called him relentless. His opponents called him ruthless. Bruce called it duty. In the Marine Corps, he'd earned 3 stars and the respect of everyone who served under him. In the legal community, he'd earned something else entirely: fear. Because when Bruce Hopkins opened an investigation, conviction rates weren't just high. They were nearly perfect. He built cases like he'd been trained to build military operations: methodical, thorough, airtight. Defense attorneys dreaded seeing his name on the prosecution. Judges knew that when General Hopkins presented evidence, it had been verified 6 different ways. But every conviction created an enemy. And enemies don't forget. For every criminal Bruce sent to prison, there was a family member who blamed him. For every corrupt network he dismantled, there were associates who swore revenge. For every powerful figure he exposed, there were allies plotting retaliation. Bruce knew this. He'd received threats over the years, dozens of them. Letters, phone calls, veiled warnings from people who thought intimidation would make him back down. It never did. He'd testified before Congress about military justice reform. He'd given interviews about the importance of accountability in positions of power. He'd trained younger prosecutors on building corruption cases. And through it all, Bruce Hopkins remained untouchable. Not because he was lucky, but because he was careful. He varied his routes. He kept his personal life private. He trusted only a small circle of people who'd proven themselves over years of service. People like his driver, Julius Cage. Julius had been with him for 8 years, driving him to courthouses, military bases, meetings with federal prosecutors. Julius knew his schedule better than anyone. Julius knew which routes he preferred, which coffee shop he stopped at on Monday mornings, which courthouse entrances had the least security delays. Julius was reliable, professional, invisible in the way good staff always are. Bruce had recommended Julius for commendations twice. He'd written a letter of reference when Julius bought his first house. He'd attended Julius's father's funeral and sent flowers when Julius's sister had her first child. Trust wasn't something Bruce gave easily, but once earned, it was absolute. That trust would turn out to be his greatest mistake. Because one of those enemies, one of the people who'd been waiting in the shadows for years, nursing a grudge and planning revenge, was closer than Bruce Hopkins ever imagined. Closer than he could have possibly guessed. Close enough to know exactly when he'd be most vulnerable. Close enough to make it look like an accident. Close enough to stand over his hospital bed afterward and smile. Bruce Hopkins trusted Julius with his life. That was his first mistake. Julius Cage had been Bruce's driver for 8 years. 8 years of arriving 15 minutes early. 8 years of keeping the vehicle immaculate. 8 years of knowing exactly which route to take depending on traffic, weather, or the general's mood. Julius was the kind of employee you forgot about in the best possible way, efficient, professional, and so reliable that Bruce stopped thinking about him as staff and started thinking of him as part of the routine. Like coffee in the morning or the newspaper on Sunday. Just there. Their relationship was cordial, professional, built on mutual respect and very few words. Bruce would slide into the back seat, Julius would adjust the mirror, and they'd drive in comfortable silence. Sometimes Bruce would take phone calls. Sometimes he'd review case files. Sometimes he'd just stare out the window, thinking. Julius never interrupted, never asked questions, never overstepped. Bruce had written Julius excellent performance reviews every year. He'd recommended him for merit raises. He'd trusted Julius with sensitive schedules, with knowing when he'd be meeting confidential informants or traveling to secure facilities. That level of trust wasn't given lightly, and Julius had never given Bruce a single reason to doubt him. But what Bruce didn't know, what he couldn't have known because Julius had been so careful to hide it, was that Julius Cage had a brother, Marcus Cage. And 10 years ago, Bruce Hopkins had sent Marcus to prison for 12 years on charges of embezzlement and fraud. Marcus had been a civilian contractor working with the Marine Corps, skimming money from supply chain operations. The evidence had been overwhelming. The trial had been quick. The sentence had been appropriate. Bruce Hopkins had prosecuted hundreds of cases. Marcus Cage was just another name in a long list of convictions, another criminal who'd believed he wouldn't get caught, another case file that got closed and filed away. Bruce never thought about Marcus Cage after the sentencing. Why would he? The case was over. Justice had been served. The system had worked exactly as it should. But Julius thought about it every single day. Marcus was his older brother, his only sibling, the person who'd helped raise him after their parents died. And now Marcus was sitting in a federal prison, his reputation destroyed, his career finished, his marriage fallen apart. Julius visited him once a month, making the 4-hour drive to the facility, sitting across from his brother in the visiting room, watching Marcus grow harder and more bitter with each passing year. Julius never forgot. He just waited. He'd applied for the driver position 6 months after Marcus's conviction. He'd passed the background checks, sailed through the interviews, presented himself as exactly what Bruce Hopkins needed: competent, trustworthy, forgettable. He'd spent 8 years building that trust, 8 years being the perfect employee, 8 years learning everything about Bruce Hopkins. His patterns, his preferences, his vulnerabilities. Julius knew Bruce's schedule better than anyone. He knew every route Bruce preferred and every alternate route they'd take if traffic was bad. He knew every habit, from the way Bruce checked his phone exactly 3 times during the morning commute to the way he always wanted the temperature set to exactly 72 degrees. He knew every weakness, from Bruce's bad knee that made him slower getting in and out of the vehicle to his tendency to work late on Thursdays when fewer people were around. And Julius had been patient. Because revenge, real revenge, required perfect timing and an opportunity that wouldn't come back around. It required trust. It required access. It required Bruce Hopkins to never see it coming. Comment: I stand for justice. If you think betrayal like this is unforgivable, let's see where you stand. October 16th started like any other Thursday. Bruce Hopkins had 3 meetings scheduled: a case review at 9, a deposition at 11, and a classified briefing at the Pentagon at 3. Julius Cage was supposed to drive him. But at 7:45 that morning, Julius called in sick. First time in 8 years. Bruce didn't think anything of it. People get sick. Julius sounded terrible on the phone, apologetic, congested. He'd already arranged for a replacement driver, someone from the motor pool who knew the routes. Bruce thanked him, told him to rest, and thought nothing more about it. Why would he? Julius had earned that trust over 8 years of perfect service. What Bruce didn't know was that Julius had spent the previous night in the motor pool garage. He'd signed in using his supervisor's credentials, accessed the vehicle bay, and spent 2 careful hours working on the brake system of Bruce's usual car. Julius knew cars. He'd learned from his father, who'd been a mechanic for 30 years. He knew exactly which brake pads to compromise, exactly how much to weaken them so they'd hold for the first part of the drive but fail catastrophically under stress. It was precise work. Too much damage and the replacement driver would notice during the pre-drive inspection. Too little and the brakes might hold all day. Julius calculated everything: the weight of the vehicle, the typical speed on Route 95 South, the section of highway with the sharpest turns. He knew Bruce would be heading to the Pentagon that afternoon. He knew which route the replacement driver would take. He knew where the brakes would fail. And then Julius went home, called in sick, and waited. The rain started just after 2 o'clock. Heavy, sudden, the kind of downpour that turns highways into rivers and cuts visibility to almost nothing. The replacement driver, a young corporal named Stevens, drove carefully, both hands on the wheel, wipers on full speed. Bruce sat in the back, reviewing briefing documents, completely absorbed in his work. They were 15 minutes from the Pentagon when it happened. Stevens touched the brake pedal to slow down for the curve ahead. Nothing. He pressed harder. Still nothing. The pedal went straight to the floor. Stevens's eyes went wide and he pumped the brakes again, desperately trying to find pressure, any pressure at all. The car was doing 70 miles per hour on a rain-slicked highway and the brakes were gone. Bruce looked up from his documents just as Stevens yanked the emergency brake. The car lurched, fishtailed, and Stevens fought the wheel, trying to keep them on the road. But physics doesn't negotiate. The vehicle spun once, twice, then slammed sideways into the concrete barrier. Metal screamed. Glass shattered. The world became a chaos of sound and motion and impact. When the car finally stopped moving, it was facing the wrong direction, crumpled on the driver's side, steam hissing from the destroyed engine. Stevens was conscious, dazed, bleeding from a cut on his forehead. In the back seat, Bruce Hopkins wasn't moving. The official report called it mechanical failure. Brake system malfunction due to worn components. An unfortunate accident. No one was at fault. Julius Cage, reading the report from his apartment that evening, called it justice. His brother had lost everything because of Bruce Hopkins. Now it was Bruce's turn. Bruce survived, barely. Emergency surgery. Fractured skull. Internal bleeding. Broken ribs. Collapsed lung. The doctors gave him a 30% chance of making it through the first night. Even if he did survive, they said, the brain trauma was severe. He might never wake up. And if he did wake up, he'd likely never be the same. Julius visited that first night. He walked into the ICU, showed his credentials as the general's driver, and stood over the bed. Bruce lay there, tubes and wires everywhere, machines breathing for him, monitoring every struggling heartbeat. Julius looked down at the man who'd destroyed his brother's life and smiled. Because he thought Bruce would never wake up. Bruce Hopkins woke up on the third day, but nobody knew it. The medical term is locked-in syndrome, a rare neurological condition where the patient is fully conscious, fully aware, but completely paralyzed, unable to move anything except sometimes the eyes. In Bruce's case, even his eyes wouldn't respond. He could hear every word the doctors said. He could feel every needle, every tube, every adjustment the nurses made. He could think with perfect clarity, but he couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't scream, couldn't tell anyone that he was trapped inside his own body, fully awake, completely alone. The doctors discussed his prognosis in the room as if he wasn't there. Severe traumatic brain injury, minimal brain activity, poor outlook for recovery. They debated whether to continue aggressive treatment or transition to comfort care. Bruce heard every word and couldn't respond. Couldn't beg them to keep trying. Couldn't tell them he was still in there, still fighting, still aware. The terror of those first hours was unlike anything he'd experienced in 30 years of military service. He'd faced enemy combatants. He'd testified against cartel assassins who'd threatened his family. He'd walked into courtrooms knowing there were people in the gallery who wanted him dead. But this was different. This was being buried alive inside his own body. This was drowning while everyone around him believed he was peacefully unconscious. And then, on the fourth day, Julius came to visit. Bruce heard the door open, heard footsteps approaching the bed, heard Julius's voice speaking to a nurse in the hallway. Professional. Concerned. The loyal driver checking on his boss. The nurse left, and Julius stood beside the bed in silence for almost a minute. Bruce could sense him there, could feel the presence, but couldn't understand why Julius wasn't speaking, wasn't asking the doctors questions, wasn't doing any of the things a worried friend would do. Then Julius leaned in close. Close enough that Bruce could feel his breath. And Julius whispered, "I did it. You were supposed to be gone." The words landed like a physical blow. Bruce's mind reeled, tried to process what he'd just heard, tried to make sense of it. Julius. His driver. 8 years of trust. 8 years of professional reliability. Julius had done this. Julius had caused the crash. Julius had tried to kill him. Marcus sends his regards. Julius continued, his voice barely above a whisper. My brother. You remember him? Probably not. Just another conviction to you. Just another criminal. But he was my family. And you destroyed him. So I destroyed you. Fair is fair, General. Bruce wanted to scream. Wanted to grab Julius by the throat. Wanted to open his eyes and show him that he was awake. That he'd heard everything. That Julius had just confessed to attempted murder. But his body wouldn't respond. His eyes stayed closed. His hands stayed still. He was trapped, helpless, forced to listen as his would-be killer gloated over what he thought was an unconscious victim. Julius stood up, his tone shifting back to normal volume, back to the concerned employee voice. "Rest well, sir. I'll check on you tomorrow." And then he left, closing the door quietly behind him. Bruce lay there in the darkness behind his closed eyes, his mind screaming into the void. Julius had tried to murder him. Julius would get away with it. And there was nothing, absolutely nothing, Bruce could do about it. The man who'd spent 30 years ensuring no one was above the law couldn't even report his own attempted murder. Days passed like torture. Julius visited every afternoon, always when fewer staff members were around. He'd stand by the bed, sometimes silent, sometimes talking about the weather or the funeral arrangements he was helping to plan, always playing the role perfectly. The devoted driver, the loyal friend. And Bruce could only lie there and listen, powerless, voiceless, invisible. But someone else was watching. Someone who noticed things others didn't. Someone who was about to change everything. If you believe scammers and criminals should never win, drop a like. Show them they picked the wrong general to mess with. Maria Blum had a gift. She noticed things. Small things. The kind of details most people miss. In 15 years of nursing, Maria had learned that medicine wasn't just about following protocols and administering medications. It was about observation, about seeing the slight change in a patient's color that indicated infection before the fever spiked, about hearing the subtle shift in breathing that meant pneumonia was developing, about sensing when a family member's grief was turning into something darker, something dangerous. Her colleagues called it intuition. Maria called it paying attention. She'd worked in 3 different hospitals across 2 states, always receiving excellent evaluations, always requested by families who'd worked with her before. Maria wasn't the most gregarious nurse on the floor. She didn't do small talk particularly well, but patients trusted her because she saw them, really saw them, not just as cases or room numbers, but as people. And when something was wrong, Maria noticed. Richmond Memorial hired her in early November, bringing her onto the ICU team during their busy season. Her first week was orientation, paperwork, learning the hospital's systems and procedures. Her second week, she was assigned to actual patients. One of them was Marine General Bruce Hopkins in room 847. Maria read his chart before her first shift. Car accident. Severe traumatic brain injury. Locked-in syndrome suspected but not confirmed. Prognosis poor. Family, none listed. Regular visitor, Julius Cage, driver and friend. She noted everything, committing it to memory the way she always did, then headed to his room. Bruce looked peaceful lying there. The machines hummed and beeped around him, doing the work his body couldn't do on its own. Maria introduced herself even though the doctors had told her he probably couldn't hear anything. She'd been a nurse too long to assume unconscious patients were truly unaware. She'd seen too many cases where patients later reported hearing everything said at their bedside. "Good morning, General Hopkins. My name is Maria. I'll be taking care of you today." She checked his vitals, adjusted his 4-line, made notes on her tablet. Everything was routine. Everything was normal. Until Julius Cage arrived for his daily visit. Maria was standing near the monitors when Julius walked in. He had flowers, grocery store carnations, and he set them on the windowsill with practiced ease. A man who'd done this many times before. He nodded to Maria politely, asked how the general was doing, listened to her brief update. Nothing unusual. Nothing wrong. Then Dr. Patterson entered for rounds. He reviewed Bruce's chart, discussed the latest CT scan results, and mentioned, almost casually, that there were some encouraging signs. Minor improvements in brain activity. Nothing definite, but possibly, maybe, the general's chances of recovery were slightly better than initially projected. Maria watched Julius's face as the doctor spoke. Most people, hearing that kind of news about a friend, would show relief, hope, some kind of positive reaction. But Julius's jaw tightened. Just for a second, his shoulders went rigid, and his hands, which had been relaxed at his sides, curled into fists. It was barely noticeable. The doctor didn't catch it, but Maria did. That was her first observation. The way Julius reacted to good news, as if it were a threat. The second observation came 20 minutes later. Dr. Patterson had left, and Julius sat in the chair beside Bruce's bed, scrolling through his phone. Maria was updating medication records at the small desk in the corner. She glanced up just as Julius looked toward the bed, and she saw Bruce's right hand. It was clenched, tight, the tendons in his wrist visible from the strain. She'd seen that hand relaxed an hour ago. She was certain of it, and now it was clenched. She looked from the hand to Julius, who was still staring at his phone, seemingly unaware. But the timing was impossible to ignore. Julius enters the room. Bruce's hand clenches. Coincidence? Maybe. But Maria's instincts were humming. The third observation happened as Julius was leaving. Maria walked him to the door, standard practice, making sure visitors knew when visiting hours ended and when they could return. Julius thanked her, polite and proper, but the entire conversation, all 30 seconds of it, he never quite made eye contact. His gaze slid past her shoulder, focused on the floor, glanced at the doorway. Anywhere but directly at her. People who feel guilty avoid eye contact. Maria had seen it 100 times. Family members who'd waited too long to bring in a sick relative. Adult children who'd been neglecting elderly parents. Spouses who'd caused the injuries they claimed were accidents. Julius Cage was avoiding eye contact with medical staff, and Maria wanted to know why. After he left, Maria stood in the hallway for a long moment, thinking. Something wasn't right here. She couldn't articulate exactly what. She had no evidence. No proof. Just 3 small observations that individually meant nothing, but together created a pattern. A wrong pattern. Maria Blum had learned to trust those instincts. And right now, they were screaming that General Bruce Hopkins wasn't just fighting for his life against injuries from an accident. He was fighting something else entirely. Maria started keeping notes. Not in the official medical chart. Those were reviewed by supervisors and subject to legal protocols, but in a small notebook she kept in her scrub pocket. Private observations. Details that seemed important even if she couldn't yet explain why. Day 1 with General Hopkins. Julius arrived at 2:15 in the afternoon. Maria checked the visitor log later and found a pattern going back weeks. Julius came every day between 2 and 3 o'clock. Always the quiet hours. Always after lunch when the ICU was less busy, when doctors were done with morning rounds and hadn't yet started evening assessments, when fewer nurses were at the station because everyone was catching up on charting. Day 2, Julius positioned himself between the bed and the door. Every single time. Maria tested it. She stood near the window, forcing Julius to walk past the bed to greet her. He did, but within 2 minutes, he'd moved. Adjusting the flowers. Straightening the blanket. Always finding a reason to place himself between Bruce and the exit. Maria had worked with protective family members before. Parents who hovered. Spouses who feared leaving their loved one alone. But this felt different. This felt like blocking. Like Julius wasn't protecting the general from the outside world. He was protecting the outside world from the general. Day 3, Maria watched how Julius interacted with the medical staff. Polite, deferential, but always brief. When nurses came in to check vitals, Julius would step back, go silent, wait for them to leave. When doctors arrived, he'd excuse himself entirely, saying he didn't want to be in the way. Most concerned friends asked questions, wanted updates, demanded to know every detail of treatment plans. Julius asked nothing. He just waited for the staff to leave so he could be alone with Bruce again. Day 4. Bruce's hand clenched again when Julius entered. Maria was certain now. She'd been watching specifically for it, and there it was. The moment Julius's footsteps crossed the threshold, Bruce's right hand tightened into a fist. It stayed that way for the entire visit. The moment Julius left, within minutes, the hand relaxed. Maria knew what she was seeing. She just didn't know what it meant. On day 5, she tried talking to Sandra Vickers, the senior nurse who'd been in the ICU for 12 years. Sandra was experienced, respected, someone who might listen. Maria found her at the nurse's station during a quiet moment and asked if they could talk privately. They stepped into the break room. Maria explained what she'd noticed. The visit schedule, the positioning, the way Julius avoided medical staff, the hand clenching, the body language when doctors mentioned recovery. Sandra listened, her face neutral, and when Maria finished, Sandra sighed. Maria, I understand you're new here, and you're trying to be thorough. But what you're describing is grief. The man's friend almost died. He's processing trauma. Of course he's tense. Of course he's emotional. You're reading too much into normal human behavior. Maria pressed. But the hand clenching, it's consistent. Every time Julius enters the room. Muscle spasms, Sanders said. The general has severe neurological damage. Random muscle responses are completely normal. They don't mean anything. She put a hand on Maria's shoulder, not unkindly. I know you want to help, but sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. Julius Cage has been visiting every day for weeks. He brings flowers. He sits with a man who can't even acknowledge he's there. That's loyalty. That's friendship. Don't look for problems where there aren't any. Maria left the break room feeling frustrated and foolish. Maybe Sandra was right. Maybe she was seeing patterns that didn't exist. Maybe her instincts were wrong this time. She'd been at Richmond Memorial less than 2 weeks. Who was she to question the assessment of a senior nurse who'd worked here for over a decade? But Maria trusted her instincts. And her instincts were screaming. She went back to room 847 and stood in the doorway, watching Bruce Hopkins lie motionless in that bed. If she was wrong, she was wasting time on paranoid observations. If she was right, something terrible was happening, and she was the only person who'd noticed. The weight of that possibility sat heavy in her chest. Maria made a decision. She'd keep watching, keep documenting, keep paying attention, because in 15 years of nursing, her instincts had saved lives. And she wasn't about to ignore them now, even if no one else believed her. Then came the afternoon that changed everything. It was a Wednesday afternoon, unseasonably cold for November, and Maria was restocking the medication cart in the supply room adjacent to the ICU corridor. She heard footsteps, familiar ones, Julius Cage's deliberate stride, and then they stopped. She glanced through the small window in the supply room door and saw him standing near the water fountain, phone pressed to his ear, his back to her. Maria wasn't trying to eavesdrop. She was just doing her job, organizing medication trays, checking expiration dates. But then she heard Julius's voice, low and controlled, and something in his tone made her freeze. It's done. No one suspects anything. The words cut through the ambient noise of the hospital like a blade. Maria's hand stopped moving. Her breath caught. She stayed perfectly still, listening. There was a pause while whoever was on the other end spoke. Then Julius continued. The doctors say he might recover. Might. They don't know anything. He's not waking up. Trust me. Another pause. No, I'm careful. I visit every day. I play the concerned friend. No one's looking at me. Maria felt her heart hammering against her ribs. She moved closer to the door, careful not to make a sound, straining to hear every word. The brake inspection cleared, Julius said. Mechanical failure. Just like we planned. They're not investigating anything. It's over. His voice dropped even lower. Even if he did wake up, which he won't, he doesn't know anything. He was unconscious before the crash. There's no evidence. No trail. We're clear. The call ended. Julius pocketed his phone and walked toward room 847 like nothing had happened. Like he hadn't just confirmed, in explicit detail, that he'd sabotaged the brakes. That he'd planned the crash. That he'd tried to murder Bruce Hopkins. Maria stood in the supply room, her mind racing. She'd been right. Every instinct, every observation, every suspicion had been correct. Julius Cage wasn't a grieving friend. He was an attempted murderer. And he'd just confessed to it, not knowing anyone was listening. But who would believe her? She had no recording, no witness, just her word against his. And Julius had spent weeks building credibility, playing the loyal driver, the devoted friend. He'd fooled the doctors. He'd fooled the senior nurses. He'd fooled everyone. If Maria went to hospital security right now and told them what she'd heard, would they believe her? Or would they think she was the paranoid new nurse Sandra had already dismissed? She had no proof. Just a phone call, a feeling, and a patient who couldn't speak. Maria's hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the medication cart. She thought about Sandra's words from 2 days ago. You're reading too much into grief. Don't look for problems where there aren't any. If Maria reported this and it went nowhere, if Julius denied everything and she couldn't prove it, what then? Would she be labeled as unstable? Fired for making false accusations? Would her nursing career be destroyed because she'd spoken up without evidence? But if she did nothing, what would happen to Bruce Hopkins? Julius had just said the general might recover. And Julius couldn't let that happen. Because if Bruce woke up, if he could communicate, if he could tell investigators what really happened, Julius would go to prison. Which meant Julius had a motive to make sure Bruce never woke up. A motive to finish what he'd started. Maria knew how easy it would be. An air bubble in an 4-line. An overdose of sedatives. A pillow held a few seconds too long during a moment when no one was watching. Julius visited every day. He had access. He had opportunity. And now Maria knew he had intent. If she stayed silent, Bruce Hopkins might not survive the week. The man had spent 30 years ensuring no one was above the law, and now he was lying helpless while his would-be killer walked free, visiting him daily, waiting for the right moment to finish the job. Maria closed her eyes and made her decision. She couldn't live with herself if she did nothing, even if no one believed her, even if it destroyed her career, even if she was wrong. Though every cell in her body knew she wasn't, she had to try. That night, Maria did something that would either save a life or destroy her career. She walked into room 847 after visiting hours ended, when the ICU was quiet and most of the staff had gone home. She closed the door behind her, and she did the one thing no one expected. She told the general everything. Would you have spoken up or stayed quiet? Comment, I'd speak up if you'd risk everything for the truth. Let's see how many of you are on Maria's side. Maria's night shift started at 11. The ICU was quiet, most patients sedated for sleep, the hallways dim except for the glow of monitoring stations. She'd volunteered for the overnight specifically so she could be alone with Bruce Hopkins, so she could talk to him without interruption, without anyone overhearing, without anyone thinking she'd lost her mind. She entered room 847 at 11:30 and closed the door softly behind her. The machines hummed their steady rhythm. Bruce lay exactly as he had for weeks, eyes closed, face peaceful, giving no indication that anyone lived behind that stillness. Maria pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down. Her hands were shaking. She didn't know if he could hear her. The doctor said probably not. Locked-in syndrome patients sometimes retained auditory processing, but Bruce's case was classified as severe traumatic brain injury with minimal responsiveness. The medical consensus was that he was essentially gone. A body kept alive by machines, waiting for a family that didn't exist to make the decision to let him go. But Maria had seen his hand clench. She'd seen the patterns, and she'd spent 15 years learning that the human body communicates in ways medicine doesn't always recognize. So she spoke anyway. General Hopkins, my name is Maria Blum. I've been your nurse for the past week. Her voice was quiet, steady, though her heart was racing. I don't know if you can hear me, but I'm going to talk to you like you can, because I think you deserve to know the truth. She paused, gathering her thoughts, choosing her words carefully. I know who did this to you. Your driver, Julius Cage. I heard him on the phone today. He sabotaged your brakes. He caused the crash. And he's been coming here every day not because he cares about you, but because he needs to make sure you don't wake up. Maria's voice caught slightly. I know you probably can't respond. I know the doctors think you're unconscious. But if you're in there, if any part of you can hear me, I want you to know that I'm going to report him. I'm going to tell security what I heard. I'm going to make sure he doesn't get away with this. The monitors beeped. The ventilator hissed. Bruce didn't move. Maria continued. I don't have proof yet, just what I overheard. But I'm going to find it. I'm going to keep watching him. I'm going to document everything. And I'm not going to let him hurt you again. She reached out and placed her hand gently on his forearm, the way she'd done with countless patients over the years. A human connection. A reminder that he wasn't alone. You spent your whole career making sure criminals faced justice. You sent bad people to prison. You stood up for what was right even when it was dangerous. And now you can't stand up for yourself. Her voice grew stronger. So I'm going to stand up for you. Even if no one believes me. Even if they think I'm crazy. You're not alone, General Hopkins. Not anymore. Maria sat in the silence that followed, watching his face for any sign, any flicker of awareness. Nothing. The doctors were probably right. He was gone. She was talking to an empty shell, projecting hope onto a situation that had none. She was about to stand up, about to leave him to sleep, when she saw it. A single tear, sliding slowly down his left cheek. Maria's breath stopped. She leaned forward, staring, making sure she wasn't imagining it. But there it was, catching the dim light from the monitors, a tear rolling down the face of a man the doctors said couldn't cry, couldn't feel, couldn't respond. You can hear me, Maria whispered. Not a question, a statement. You've been hearing everything. Another tear followed the first. And then Bruce's right hand, the one she'd been watching for days, clenched tight. So tight his knuckles went white. It wasn't a spasm. It wasn't random. It was deliberate. It was communication. It was a man trapped in his own body, screaming the only way he could. Maria felt her own eyes filling with tears. She gripped his hand carefully, feeling the tension in his fingers, feeling the life that everyone else had missed. I understand. I see you. And I promise you, I'm going to fix this. Julius Cage is not going to win. She stayed there for another 10 minutes, holding his hand, feeling it gradually relax, as if he'd finally been able to release some impossible weight. When she stood to leave, she looked down at him one more time. In that moment, Maria Blum became more than a nurse. She became his only weapon, the only person who knew the truth, the only person who believed he was still fighting, the only person standing between Bruce Hopkins and the man who'd tried to kill him. She left room 847 with a clarity she hadn't felt in days. She knew what she had to do. She knew who she had to talk to. And she knew that whether anyone believed her or not, she was going to make sure Julius Cage answered for what he'd done. Because Bruce Hopkins couldn't fight for himself, but Maria could fight for him. And that's exactly what she intended to do. Maria didn't go to the police. She thought about it, spent the rest of her shift weighing the options, but ultimately decided against it. The problem was jurisdictional complexity. The crash had happened on a federal highway. Bruce was a Marine general. Julius worked for the Department of Defense. If she called the local police, they'd have to involve federal authorities, and federal authorities would want evidence, probable cause, something more substantial than a nurse's account of an overheard phone call and a patient's tears. By the time the bureaucracy sorted itself out, Julius might disappear. Or worse, he might finish what he'd started. So at 6 in the morning, when her shift ended, Maria went to hospital security instead. Richmond Memorial had its own security department, former law enforcement mostly, people who understood how to handle sensitive situations discreetly. Maria asked to speak with the director, a man named Thomas Garrett who'd been a detective with Richmond PD for 20 years before retiring into hospital security. She met him in his small office near the emergency department entrance. Garrett was in his late 50s, gray hair, sharp eyes, and the kind of presence that made people tell the truth. Maria sat across from his desk and told him everything. The observations, the phone call, the tears, Bruce's hand clenching, all of it. Garrett listened without interrupting. When Maria finished, he leaned back in his chair and was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "If you're right, and I'm not saying you're wrong, we've got an attempted murder suspect visiting a victim daily. If you're wrong, we've got a grieving friend and a nurse who might be seeing patterns that aren't there." "I know how it sounds," Maria said. "Actually, it sounds like you've got good instincts." Garrett pulled out a notepad. "But instincts don't hold up in court. We need evidence. And the problem is, the vehicle inspection already cleared the crash as mechanical failure. No foul play. No investigation. Case closed." "Then we reopen it," Maria said. Garrett nodded slowly. "I can make some calls. Quietly. I've still got contacts with the state police, and they've got relationships with federal investigators. If there's something to find in that vehicle, they'll find it. But it's been 3 weeks. If Julius sabotaged the brakes, he did it carefully. Any evidence is going to be subtle. What if we make him show us where the evidence is?" Maria asked. Garrett raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "He thinks he's safe," Maria explained. "He thinks the inspection cleared him. He thinks no one suspects anything. But if he suddenly thought the vehicle was going to be inspected again, more carefully this time, what would he do?" Garrett's expression shifted. "Understanding. If he's innocent, he'd do nothing. If he's guilty, he'd panic," Maria finished. "He'd try to destroy the evidence before anyone found it. They couldn't arrest Julius without proof, but they could make him panic. And panic makes people careless, makes them reveal themselves, makes them do exactly the thing that proves their guilt." Garrett made his calls. By 8 that morning, he'd connected with an investigator from the Virginia State Police who specialized in vehicle tampering cases. The investigator agreed to put surveillance on the impound lot where the crashed vehicle was stored. They'd watch it, quietly. No visible police presence. Just cameras and a couple of plainclothes officers in an unmarked car parked across the street. The trap was set. Now they needed Julius to walk into it. The strategy was simple. Maria would mention, casually, within Julius's earshot, that the crashed vehicle was going to be inspected the following day. Something about insurance requirements and secondary mechanical analysis. She'd say it naturally, like it was routine hospital gossip, nothing to worry about. If Julius was innocent, the information would mean nothing to him. He'd hear it and forget it. But if Julius was guilty, if he knew there was evidence in that vehicle that could prove he'd sabotaged the brakes, he couldn't let that inspection happen. He'd have to act. He'd have to go to the impound lot and destroy whatever evidence remained before investigators found it. Fear is a powerful confession. And Julius Cage, for all his careful planning, for all his patience over 8 years, was about to be afraid. Maria's role was crucial. She had to act normal. Had to treat Julius exactly the way she'd been treating him all week, professional, courteous, unsuspecting. She couldn't let him see that anything had changed. Couldn't let him know that she'd overheard his phone call or that security was now involved. Julius had to believe he was still in control, still safe, still undetected. Garrett warned her. If he suspects you know something, if he thinks you're a threat, this gets dangerous. Attempted murder suspects don't like witnesses. You understand that. Maria understood. But she also understood that Bruce Hopkins was lying in room 847, conscious and aware, trapped inside his own body while his would-be killer visited him daily. Someone had to stop Julius. And right now, Maria was the only one who could. That afternoon, when Julius arrived for his daily visit at 2:15, Maria was ready. She'd rehearsed the line a dozen times, practiced the tone, the casual delivery, the complete lack of emphasis that would make it seem unimportant. Just another piece of mundane hospital information. Julius walked past the nurse's station. Maria looked up from her charting, smiled politely, and said the words that would either catch a killer or prove her wrong. The words that would set everything in motion. The words that Julius Cage would spend the rest of his life wishing he'd never heard. The following day felt impossibly long. Maria arrived for her shift at 7 in the morning, knowing that Julius wouldn't appear until early afternoon. 5 hours of waiting. 5 hours of checking the clock, reviewing her plan, rehearsing the exact tone and cadence she'd use when she delivered the line. It had to sound casual, unimportant, the kind of administrative detail that hospital staff mentioned in passing without thinking twice about it. She went about her normal routine. Checked vitals, administered medications, charted patient updates. But her mind was elsewhere, running through scenarios, anticipating Julius's possible reactions. Would he take the bait? Would he see through it? Would he suspect that she knew? Thomas Garrett had texted her that morning confirming everything was in place. Surveillance team positioned across from the impound lot. Cameras recording. Officers ready. All they needed now was for Julius to make his move. If he did nothing, if he stayed calm and let the inspection happen, then either Maria was wrong about everything or Julius was better at controlling his fear than they'd anticipated. At 1:30, Maria was at the nurse's station updating Bruce's chart when she saw Julius walking down the corridor. Right on schedule. 2:15. Give or take 15 minutes, every single day for 3 weeks. He carried his usual grocery store flowers, wore his usual expression of quiet concern, walked with his usual measured pace. Nothing different. Nothing wrong. Maria's heart rate picked up. This was it. She looked down at her tablet, pretending to focus on documentation, waiting for the right moment. Julius passed the station, nodded politely to another nurse, and continued toward room 847. Maria let him get 3 steps past, then called out, keeping her voice light and conversational. "Oh, Julius, did you hear?" He stopped, turned back. "Hear what?" Maria kept her eyes on her tablet, tapping something random on the screen as if she was still working. "They're doing another inspection on the vehicle from the general's accident. Tomorrow, I think. Something about the brake system. Insurance requirements or liability review. I'm not really sure. Just heard some administrators talking about it earlier." She glanced up briefly, gave him a small smile, the kind you'd give anyone when sharing mundane hospital gossip, then looked back at her tablet as if the conversation was already over. As if what she'd just said was completely inconsequential. Julius's face didn't change. His expression remained neutral, politely attentive, exactly what you'd expect from someone hearing irrelevant administrative information. But Maria was watching his hands, and his hands told a different story. They trembled. Just for a second. A barely perceptible shake that he controlled almost immediately, curling his fingers around the stems of the flowers he was holding to hide the movement. But Maria saw it. That split second where his body betrayed what his face wouldn't show. Fear. Sudden, sharp, unmistakable fear. "Oh," Julius said, his voice steady. "I didn't know they did follow-up inspections." "I guess when it's a high-profile case, they're more thorough," Maria said, still keeping her tone casual, disinterested. "Anyway, just thought you might want to know in case anyone asked you questions. You were his driver, so they might want a statement or something. Right?" Thanks for letting me know. Julius nodded, then turned and continued toward Bruce's room. Maria didn't watch him go. She kept her eyes on her tablet, kept her breathing steady, kept her face neutral. But inside, her mind was racing. He'd reacted. Subtly, but he'd reacted. The trap was working. Julius's visit that day was shorter than usual. Normally, he stayed 30 to 40 minutes, sitting quietly by Bruce's bed, scrolling through his phone, maintaining his performance as the loyal friend. But today he was in and out in less than 15 minutes. Maria heard him leave, heard his footsteps moving quickly down the corridor, faster than his usual pace. She waited 5 minutes, then walked casually to the window at the end of the hallway that overlooked the parking lot. She watched Julius emerge from the hospital entrance, saw him pull out his phone and make a call, saw the tense set of his shoulders, the way he kept glancing around as if checking whether anyone was watching. Maria pulled out her own phone and texted Garrett. He's leaving. Earlier than usual. Looked rattled. Garrett's response came immediately. Surveillance team notified. We wait. And so they waited. Maria finished her shift, went home to her small apartment, tried to eat dinner, but couldn't manage more than a few bites. She kept checking her phone, waiting for an update, waiting to hear if Julius had taken the bait, waiting to know if her instincts had been right or if she'd just jeopardized her career over a misread situation. The impound lot where Bruce's crashed vehicle was stored closed at 6 in the evening. It wouldn't reopen until 8 the next morning. If Julius was going to act, it would be tonight, under cover of darkness, when he thought no one would be watching. Maria lay in bed that night, unable to sleep, staring at her phone in the darkness. Garrett had promised to call her the moment anything happened. But as the hours passed, midnight, 1 in the morning, 2 in the morning, her phone stayed silent. Maybe Julius wasn't going to act. Maybe he decided the risk was too great. Maybe he was smarter than they'd anticipated and had seen through the trap. Or maybe, just maybe, Maria had been wrong about everything from the beginning. At 2:47 in the morning, her phone finally rang. Julius Cage arrived at the Henrico County impound facility at 12:43 in the morning. The surveillance team had been positioned since 8 that evening. 2 plainclothes officers in an unmarked sedan parked across the street, cameras mounted with clear sight lines to the entrance and the vehicle storage area. They'd been waiting for over 4 hours when Julius's car pulled up 2 blocks away, headlights off, moving slowly through the industrial district like he was trying not to be noticed. He couldn't let them find the evidence. The altered brake pads would tell the whole story. Julius had been meticulous when he'd sabotaged the system 3 weeks ago, but he knew forensic investigators. Knew they could find microscopic tool marks, stress fractures that didn't match normal wear patterns, evidence of deliberate tampering that the initial inspection had missed. If they looked closely enough, if they brought in specialists, they'd see what he'd done. And once they saw it, they'd start asking questions. Questions that would lead back to him. The impound lot was surrounded by chain-link fencing topped with barbed wire, locked gates, security lights illuminating the rows of damaged vehicles waiting for insurance claims and legal proceedings. Julius sat in his car for nearly 10 minutes, watching, making sure no one was around. The facility had cameras, he knew that, but they were old, grainy, the kind that recorded but rarely got reviewed unless there was a specific incident. And by the time anyone thought to check the footage, if they ever did, Julius would be long gone. The brake components would be destroyed. The evidence would be gone. There'd be nothing to find. He got out of his car, carrying a small backpack with tools, a flashlight, and a pair of work gloves. The main gate was locked, but Julius had worked around secure facilities before. He knew how to find the weak points. There was a section of fence on the east side where the chain link had separated slightly from the post, just enough gap for someone to squeeze through if they were determined. Julius was very determined. At 12:57, he was inside the lot, moving between the rows of wrecked vehicles, using his flashlight sparingly, keeping to the shadows. He knew where Bruce's car would be. High-profile case. Federal employee. They'd have stored it in the back section, away from the regular inventory. It took him 4 minutes to find it. The vehicle was worse than he'd expected. The entire driver's side was crushed, windows shattered, metal twisted from the impact with the concrete barrier. But the brake system was what mattered. Julius dropped to his knees beside the front wheel, pulled out his tools, and started working. He needed to remove the compromised brake pads, destroy them completely, make sure no one could ever prove they'd been deliberately weakened. His hands moved quickly, efficiently, unscrewing the caliper bolts, accessing the pads he'd altered 3 weeks ago. He was so focused on the work, so consumed with removing the evidence, that he didn't hear the footsteps approaching from 3 different directions. Didn't see the officers moving quietly through the lot, surrounding him, cutting off every exit. Didn't realize he'd walked into a trap until the first flashlight turned on, shining directly in his face. Then another, and another. Suddenly Julius was surrounded by light, 6 officers with weapons drawn, all of them positioned in a careful perimeter around him. He froze, still kneeling beside the vehicle, still holding the brake pad in his gloved hand. The evidence, the proof. The thing he'd come to destroy now held in his grip like a confession. Julius Cage, don't move. Keep your hands where we can see them. Julius's face in that moment told the whole story. Shock, disbelief, the sudden understanding that he'd been played, that someone had known, that the inspection announcement had been bait and he'd taken it. His eyes darted around, looking for an escape route, but there wasn't one. The officers closed in slowly, professionally, giving him no options. Drop what you're holding and put your hands behind your head. The brake pad fell from Julius's gloved fingers and landed in the dirt beside the vehicle. Police had been waiting for 2 hours, positioned since 10 that evening, ready for him. They'd known he'd come. They'd known exactly what he'd try to do. And now they had him, caught in the act, with the evidence literally in his hands. Julius Cage, you're under arrest for attempted murder, tampering with evidence, and breaking and entering. You have the right to remain silent. They cuffed him there in the impound lot, read him his rights while he knelt in the dirt beside the vehicle he'd sabotaged. Julius didn't say anything, didn't resist, just stared at the brake pad lying in the dirt, the piece of metal that proved everything. His 8 years of patience, his careful planning, his perfect crime. All of it destroyed because he'd panicked, because he'd been afraid, because fear had made him careless. As they led him to the patrol car, Julius looked up at the cameras he'd thought were too old to matter, at the officers who'd been watching him the entire time, at the trap he'd walked into thinking he was destroying evidence, when really he was creating it. And for the first time since the day he'd sabotaged Bruce Hopkins's brakes, Julius Cage understood that he'd lost. That justice, the same justice his brother had faced 10 years ago, was coming for him now. The surveillance footage would show everything. Julius entering the lot illegally. Julius accessing the vehicle. Julius removing the brake components. Julius caught with the evidence in his hands. There'd be no explaining it away. No claiming innocence. No escape. At 1:32 in the morning, Thomas Garrett called Maria Blum and told her they had him. Told her the trap had worked. Told her that Julius Cage had just confessed to attempted murder without saying a single word. If you believe justice like this should always win, smash that subscribe button. Criminals won't, but you will. Maria arrived at the hospital at 6:30 that morning, 2 hours before her shift officially started. She'd barely slept after Garrett's call, adrenaline and relief keeping her awake, replaying everything that had happened over the past week. Julius was in custody. The evidence was secured. The truth was finally coming to light. But the one person who deserved to know, the one person who'd been trapped in silence through all of it, was still lying in room 847 with no idea that justice had finally arrived. She found Thomas Garrett in the hospital lobby, looking exhausted but satisfied. He'd been at the police station all night, coordinating with investigators, making sure the arrest was processed correctly, making sure nothing got lost in the bureaucratic shuffle. He saw Maria and walked over, a tired smile on his face. He confessed, Garrett said. Took about 3 hours of interrogation, but he broke. Told them everything. The sabotage, the motive, his brother, the whole story. Maria felt something release in her chest, tension she'd been holding for days finally letting go. Everything, everything. The investigators pulled the brake components from the vehicle. Forensics confirmed tampering. Tool marks consistent with deliberate weakening. And Julius admitted he did it. Said he'd been planning it for years, waiting for the right moment. Garrett shook his head. You were right about all of it. Every instinct, every observation. You saved that man's life. Maria didn't feel like a hero. She felt tired and relieved and grateful that she'd trusted herself when no one else had believed her. Can I tell him? General Hopkins. Can I tell him what happened? The doctors want to brief him officially, but yeah, you should be the one. You earned that. Garrett put a hand on her shoulder. Good work, Maria. Really good work. Maria took the elevator to the ICU, walked the familiar corridor to room 847, and stood outside the door for a moment, gathering herself. She didn't know if he knew. Didn't know if Bruce had somehow sensed the change, the shift in the air, the absence of the threat that had been visiting him daily. She didn't know how much he understood or how much he'd been aware of during the past 24 hours. She pushed open the door and stepped inside. Bruce lay in the bed, same as always, eyes closed, machines humming, the morning light filtering through the window casting shadows across his still face. Maria walked to his bedside and sat down in the chair she'd occupied so many times over the past week. "General Hopkins," she said softly. "It's Maria. I have news." She paused, choosing her words carefully, wanting to get this right. Julius Cage was arrested last night. He went to the impound lot to destroy evidence, and the police were waiting for him. He confessed everything. The sabotage, the crash, all of it. Maria's voice grew stronger. "He's in custody now. He's going to prison. And you're safe. He can't hurt you anymore." For a long moment, nothing happened. The machines beeped. The ventilator hissed. Bruce remained motionless. Maria wondered if he'd heard her, if he understood, if any of it had reached him through whatever barriers separated his mind from his body. And then, slowly, impossibly, Bruce's eyes began to open. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't sudden. It was gradual, like someone waking from a very long sleep, his eyelids fluttering first, then opening just slightly, then wider. Maria held her breath, watching as Bruce Hopkins, who hadn't opened his eyes in 3 weeks, who the doctors had said might never wake up, looked directly at her. His eyes were clear, focused, aware, not the vacant stare of someone emerging from a coma, but the sharp, intelligent gaze of someone who'd been conscious the entire time, someone who'd been trapped, someone who'd been waiting. Maria felt tears spring to her eyes. "You're awake. You're really awake." Bruce's lips moved, trying to form words, his voice rough from disuse and the breathing tube that had only been removed 2 days prior. It took him 3 attempts, but finally the words came out, quiet but unmistakable. "You saved my life twice." Maria leaned closer, not sure she'd heard correctly. "What?" Bruce swallowed, the effort visible, and spoke again, each word deliberate. "Once by uncovering the truth. Once by giving me a reason to fight." The tears Maria had been holding back finally spilled over. She'd thought she was just doing her job, just paying attention, just trusting her instincts. But to Bruce, she'd been everything. The only person who'd noticed. The only person who'd believed. The only person who'd refused to look away. "I didn't know you could hear me," Maria said. "That night when I told you I knew, when I said I'd report him, I didn't know if you understood." "I heard every word," Bruce said, his voice getting slightly stronger. "Every word you said. Every word he said. For 3 weeks, I've been trapped. Listening. Knowing. Unable to tell anyone. Until you." He paused, exhausted from the effort of speaking, but his eyes never left hers. "Julius visited me every day. Stood over my bed. Gloated. Told me what he'd done. How he'd planned it. How he'd gotten away with it. And I couldn't move. Couldn't speak. Couldn't warn anyone." His hand moved slightly on the blanket, fingers trying to reach toward her. "I was losing hope, wondering if I'd be trapped forever, if he'd finish what he started. And then you told me you knew. You told me I wasn't alone. And that gave me something to fight for, a reason to keep trying to wake up." Maria took his hand gently, feeling the strength in his grip, the life that had been hidden beneath the stillness for so long. "You're safe now. He's going to prison. And you're going to recover. The doctors are going to be amazed." Bruce managed something that might have been a smile. "I've been listening to doctors for 3 weeks. They don't know as much as they think they do." Maria laughed through her tears, the sound breaking the tension in the room, bringing lightness to a moment that had been so heavy for so long. She'd seen a lot in 15 years of nursing. She'd seen patients recover against impossible odds. She'd seen families reunited after devastating injuries. She'd seen miracles, small and large, unfold in hospital rooms across 3 different states. But she'd never seen anything like this. She'd never seen someone fight their way back from the edge of death, not just once but twice, sustained by nothing but willpower and the voice of a nurse who refused to give up on him. Bruce Hopkins was alive. He was awake. And justice, finally, had been served. Julius Cage's trial began 4 months later in federal court. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. They had the surveillance footage from the impound yard showing Julius breaking in at 12:43 in the morning. They had the brake components he'd been caught removing, with forensic analysis confirming deliberate tampering. They had his full confession from the interrogation, recorded and transcribed, where he'd admitted to sabotaging the vehicle, planning the crash, and visiting Bruce daily to ensure he never woke up. And they had Bruce Hopkins himself, recovered enough to sit in the witness stand and tell his story. Bruce testified for 3 hours. He described the locked-in syndrome, the horror of being conscious but paralyzed, unable to communicate while Julius stood over his bed and confessed to attempted murder. He recounted every word Julius had whispered, every threat, every moment of gloating. The jury sat in stunned silence as Bruce explained what it felt like to be buried alive inside his own body while his would-be killer walked free. Maria testified too. She explained her observations, the patterns she'd noticed, the phone call she'd overheard, and the plan she'd worked with hospital security to trap Julius. The defense attorney tried to suggest she'd been overly suspicious, reading malice into innocent behavior, but the evidence made those arguments meaningless. Julius had been caught red-handed destroying evidence. There was no explaining that away. The trial lasted 2 weeks. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. Julius Cage was convicted on all counts: attempted murder, conspiracy, tampering with evidence, and breaking and entering. The judge sentenced him to 25 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. As the sentence was read, Julius sat motionless, staring straight ahead, the same blank expression he'd worn throughout the trial. No remorse, no apology, just the quiet acceptance of a man who'd gambled everything on revenge and lost. Bruce's recovery took longer than the trial. Months of intensive physical therapy, relearning how to walk, how to use his hands with full coordination, how to speak without the roughness that had lingered after the breathing tube. The doctors called it remarkable. Bruce called it necessary. He had work to return to, cases to prosecute, a career he wasn't ready to abandon just because someone had tried to kill him. 7 months after the crash, Bruce Hopkins returned to duty. Not full-time at first, limited hours, desk work mostly, but he was back. The Marine Corps welcomed him with a ceremony, though Bruce had requested they keep it small. He wasn't interested in being celebrated for surviving. He was interested in getting back to the work that mattered. Maria was honored too. The hospital presented her with their Excellence in Patient Care Award at a staff meeting. The Marine Corps sent a formal commendation, thanking her for her vigilance and courage in protecting one of their own. Maria accepted both honors graciously, though privately she still didn't feel like a hero. She'd just done what any good nurse would do. She'd paid attention. Bruce Hopkins had spent 30 years enforcing one unbreakable rule: no one was above the law. Not politicians, not corporate criminals, not corrupt officials, and now, not even the people you trust most. Julius Cage had believed that loyalty and proximity would protect him, that 8 years of service would make him invisible, above suspicion. But the law didn't care about 8 years of perfect performance. The law cared about evidence, and Julius had provided plenty of it. 6 months after Julius's sentencing, Richmond Memorial held its annual charity gala, a fundraiser for patient care programs and medical research. Bruce attended as a guest of honor, still moving a bit slowly, still rebuilding his strength, but present and alive and determined to show his gratitude to the institution that had saved him. Maria was there too, uncomfortable in formal dress, preferring her scrubs to evening wear, but she'd been specifically invited by the hospital administrator and felt obligated to attend. She stood near the refreshment table, watching the crowd, when Bruce found her. "You're hiding," he said. "I'm observing," Maria corrected. "There's a difference." Bruce smiled. It was easier now, the facial muscles having regained their full function. "You're still paying attention, still noticing things." Force of habit. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the event unfold around them. Doctors mingling with donors, administrators giving speeches about the hospital's mission, survivors sharing their stories. It was the kind of evening that celebrated life and recovery, the kind of evening that reminded everyone why they did this work. "I never thanked you properly," Bruce said after a while. "For trusting your instincts, for speaking up when no one believed you, for refusing to let him win." Maria shook her head. "You don't need to thank me. I was just doing my job." "No," Bruce said firmly. "You went beyond your job. You risked your career. You put yourself in danger. You stood up for someone who couldn't stand up for himself. He paused, choosing his words carefully. For 30 years, I've operated on the principle that justice is a solitary pursuit. That standing for what's right means standing alone. That you can't depend on anyone because people are weak, corruptible, unreliable. And now, Maria asked, now I know I was wrong. Bruce looked at her, his expression sincere. I spent 3 weeks in that hospital bed thinking I was alone, thinking no one would notice, no one would care, no one would fight for me the way I'd fought for others. And then you proved me wrong. You showed me that sometimes, when you can't stand for yourself, someone else will stand for you. Maria felt her throat tighten. You would have done the same for me. Maybe, Bruce said, but I wouldn't have noticed what you noticed. I wouldn't have trusted my instincts the way you trusted yours. You have a gift, Maria. Don't ever stop using it. They stood together at that charity gala, the general and the nurse, two people who'd been brought together by tragedy and bound together by justice. Bruce had learned something in that hospital bed, something he'd never quite understood in 30 years of prosecuting criminals and enforcing the law. He'd learned that strength wasn't just about standing firm. It was also about knowing when to trust someone else to stand for you. He'd learned he didn't have to carry the weight alone. He'd learned that sometimes, the people who save you are the ones you never see coming. And Maria had learned something too. She'd learned that paying attention matters. That small observations can save lives. That trusting yourself, even when no one else does, is sometimes the bravest thing you can do. Together, they'd stop the killer. Together, they'd serve justice. And together, they stood as proof that good people, paying attention, refusing to look away, can still change the outcome of even the darkest stories. This story reminds us that justice isn't just about the law. It's about people who refuse to look away. People like Maria Blum, who trusted her instincts when everyone else dismissed them, who saw patterns where others saw grief, who stood up for a man who couldn't stand up for himself, even when it meant risking everything she'd worked for. And people like Bruce Hopkins, who never gave up even when his body had given out, who fought from inside a prison of paralysis, who held on to consciousness and hope when every reason told him to let go. If this story moved you, if you believe in people who stand up against betrayal and corruption, then do 3 things. Hit subscribe, because we tell stories that matter. Stories about real people facing impossible situations and choosing courage over comfort. Drop a comment saying, I stand for justice. Show the trolls and the cynics they're outnumbered. Let's build a community of people who believe good still wins. And share this with someone who needs to remember that good people still win. Because in a world full of Julius Cages, people who plan in darkness and strike from positions of trust, we need more Maria Blums. We need more people who pay attention, who trust themselves, who refuse to be silent when something's wrong. Justice isn't inevitable, but it's possible, and it starts with people like you.